Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to the New Books Network. I'm your host, Tom Discenna, from the Department of Communication, Journalism, and Public Relations at Oakland University. My guest today is Simon Truwant, the author of Cassirer and Heidegger in Davos, The Philosophical Arguments. The 1929 encounter between Ernst Cassirer and Martin Heidegger in Davos, Switzerland, is considered one of the most important intellectual debates of the 20th century and a founding moment of continental philosophy. At the same time, many commentators have questioned the philosophical profundity and coherence of the actual debate. In this book, the first comprehensive philosophical study of the Davos debate, Simon Truwant challenges these critiques. He argues that Cassirer and Heidegger's disagreement about the meaning of Kant's philosophy is motivated by their different views about the human condition, which in turn are motivated by their opposing conceptions of what the task of philosophy ultimately should be. Truwant shows that Cassirer and Heidegger share a grand philosophical concern to comprehend and aid the human being's capacity to orient itself in and towards the world. Simon Truwant is FWO Postdoctoral Fellow at KU Leuven. He is the editor of Interpreting Cassirer, Critical Essays, and has published articles in journals including Idealistic Studies and the International Journal of Philosophical Studies. Simon Truwant, welcome to the New Books Network.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom, for having me. This is very exciting.
So I typically like to start these interviews by asking an author what brings them to this particular project. And I think we're going to get to that question, but I want to get to it by asking a somewhat different question, which is, what was the Davos disputation and what accounts for its enduring fascination even now, almost 100 years after it took place?
Yeah, the Davos debate, as it's very often called, is a debate between Ernst Cassirer and Martin Heidegger, but it was an afternoon of a much longer gathering in Davos, in the Swiss Alps town. In 1929, from March 17 until April 6, so 3 weeks, there was an international or internationale Davoser Hochschulkurse that was going on, something like a summer school. And in 1929, it was the second time that this took place. The year before, it was the first time that a few French and German organizers had organized this summer school with the intent of bringing together, reuniting actually, French and German thinkers. And this was motivated by the fact that in 1928, so in between the two world wars, there was a time of cultural crisis, a time of intellectual crisis, and a lack of cross-fertilization between thinkers from these different countries, which obviously was a result of the First World War. And so the Davos Hochschulkurse was aiming to overcome this. And the first edition had been a success, but for the second one, they really wanted to go big, and they managed to attract two very important thinkers at that moment. So on the one hand, you have Ernst Cassirer, who was one of the most renowned German intellectuals at the beginning of the 20th century. He was known as a great historian of philosophy, but also as a spokesman of Neo-Kantianism, which was one of the most important philosophical schools at that time. And on the other hand, there's Martin Heidegger, who only 2 years earlier, in 1927, had published Being in Time, which had caused a lot of enthusiasm within the philosophical communities because of the groundbreaking work that it clearly was and has remained to be. So these two thinkers were brought together in this setting, and there were a lot of other people present that we now know as well. So Immanuel Levinas was there, Rudolf Carnap was there, Eugen Fink, Leon Brunswick, Herbert Marcuse. So these are all people who, in their own regard, would become rather famous afterwards. They were attending as younger students or doctoral students or colleagues. And the format was such that first there was a series of independent lectures. Heidegger did 4 hours of lectures, Cassirer did 4 hours of lectures, and then that was supposed to culminate into this debate, which took place on April 2nd, 1929. There are a lot of fun anecdotes about this 3-week course. As you can imagine, Heidegger would every now and then show up in his ski suit because he loved skiing and also did not care about academic etiquette. On the other hand, Cassirer got ill for a while during this summer school. Let's keep calling it. And Heidegger would come to his room in this Hotel Belvedere, which is a spa resort, and would inform him about what his lectures had been about. So there's already a build-up for a few weeks through these independent lectures, and that build-up was not just because it took a while before the big culmination point of the Davoser Hochschulkurse took place, but also because both thinkers were already setting the stage by the topics that they choose for their lectures. Cassirer would position his own philosophy of culture with regard to philosophical anthropology and Lebensphilosophy, and also with regard to Heidegger. And this is something that he otherwise rarely did, because he had there at that point, I think there were not any publications by him which engaged with those contemporary currents. On the other hand, Heidegger, for the first time publicly, I think, presented his very original, also very controversial interpretation of Immanuel Kant's work, an interpretation that was based on his own being in time. But in doing so, he entered the domain of Kant studies, which is what Cassirer was famous for. So Cassirer and Heidegger were sort of entering each other's domain and already setting up the stage a little bit. So I think that's what you need to know about the events of what led up to this Davos debate, which was then the public debate attended by all these younger thinkers who I mentioned, which must have lasted for a couple of hours between Cassirer and Heidegger.
So then let me ask the question. So what brings you to this project?
What brought me to this project is, very simply put, the fact that there's this legendary debate. It has been commented upon for decades, which almost everyone who comments on it seems to agree that it has had a very big impact on the continuation of the history of Western philosophy. There are two famous books. One is about 10 years old. The other one is about 20 years old, who have done this and who have presented the Davos debate in such a way. There is, on the one hand, there's Michael Friedman's Parting of the Ways, which has presented this Davos debate as the last moment before the split between continental and analytic philosophy really broke through, and presents Cassirer as the last figure who could have stopped this parting of the ways, this rupture between two philosophical styles and currents. And then there's also Peter Gordon's book, Continental Divide, who also presents this as a book, as an event, Davos as an event that really shaped, mainly through how it has been remembered by later philosophers, as an event that has really shaped the self-image of contemporary philosophy. And so I'm very intrigued by the fact, on the one hand, that everyone, both present and later commenting on it, really stresses how important this debate, this event, has been for the further history of philosophy. And then at the same time, almost all of them claim that the debate itself was disappointing, that it was not a philosophically profound debate, or even that it was no debate at all. And some of the eyewitnesses already report this. Leo Strauss does this, for example, but also some of the news journalists from newspapers who were present there. They report that the debate was basically two people talking in different languages, using different discourse, having different motivations for doing philosophy, and really just talking past each other, not really engaging with each other. This is something that Heidegger also lamented. And so this seeming contradiction is, I think, the main reason that I got so interested in this debate. There are other reasons. I mean, the fact that the philosophy of Immanuel Kant is one of the main topics. That's what initially drew me into it, because Immanuel Kant was the first philosopher that I engaged with as a student. And then I got intrigued by this figure, Ernst Cassirer, who reportedly was one of the most influential philosophers at the beginning of the 20th century, and now has been very much forgotten. And the fact that Heidegger seemed to have won the debate has played a very large role in why Cassirer has been forgotten. So I got into this because there seemed to be a lot of angles to this debate, and I really wanted to re-examine whether indeed it was an actual philosophical debate or not. My answer, of course, is that it was, and that is what my whole book tries to explain.
And it does that brilliantly, because, as you say, there's typically kind of two responses that people have to the Davos debate, and one is to read it sort of symbolically, to look at the event and almost push the philosophical ideas to the background. And then the other is to say that, essentially these two people are kind of just talking past one another, that there's no debate here at all. And the really terrific thing about your book is that it kind of puts these two people back into the room together and looks at the points where they're talking and they're disagreeing about some really fundamental issues. The first of these, as you point out, is their disagreement about the proper interpretation of Kant. So I wonder if you might want to start there and talk about really both how they are speaking the same language, but they're really disagreeing about some fundamental issues.
Yeah. So indeed, this is the point where they really seem to still speak the same language. Of course, they already have some disagreements, but this is the first issue that's being brought up. So that is, according to me, also the first of three key topics of the debate, structural key topics of the debate. And here they really seem to see eye to eye, at least on one fundamental issue, and that is the importance of the faculty of transcendental imagination in Kant's philosophy. And in that regard, they are both trendsetters, because before that, there were more empirical readings of Kant's philosophy. There were more intellectualist readings of Kant's philosophy. Of course, these readings still exist, but there was a lot of emphasis on this duality of the two stems of human understanding or human knowledge, which is sensibility on the one hand and the understanding on the other hand. And then there would be a debate about which one of these stems is either more fundamental or even the only one that really counts, either according to Kant or what we should do with Kant's philosophy. And both Heidegger and Cassirer, but they seem to do this completely independently from each other, is to point out these very important passages in Kant's first critique about the power of transcendental imagination, which connects sensibility and understanding. And it had usually been understood that it connects them, let's say, afterwards, that first you have the stems of sensibility and understanding, and then they are being joined through transcendental imagination. But Cassirer and Heidegger argue that transcendental imagination is what comes first, and that sensibility and understanding are derived from that, or are dependent on that more fundamental power. And so they agree on this, and that's already that's a very important thing. But then, of course, in the end, they will still go on to disagree on, given the priority of transcendental imagination, yet whether its sensible or receptive side, or its intelligible or its spontaneous side, is the one that's most dominant, or is the one that's most important. So in the end, they will still part ways on a topic that had divided Kant scholars before, but the very acknowledgement of the primacy of transcendental imagination, so that at the very basis of our human experience, the very first time, the very instant that we sense something or intuit something or understand something, that there is always and a receptive and an spontaneous moment, that there's always a sensual and an intelligible moment. That's what brings them together here. And that is something that actually is very shortly discussed in the Davos debate, yet has sparked a lot of commentaries and has also caused a lot of interest for Heidegger's further writings on Kant. Unfortunately, less so for Cassirer's writings on Kant, but that is also then one thing that in my book I try to remedy a little bit. Yes.
So let's tease that out a little bit. Where do you see, in terms of the transcendental imagination, the points of intersection and divergence?
In Cassirer and Heidegger, you mean? Yes. So Cassirer has this new notion of symbolic imagination, because he has this philosophy of symbolic forms, and the symbolic forms are, say, the transcendental preconditions for what we would call cultural domains: science, religion, politics, language, economics, and so forth. And in a Kantian fashion, Cassirer says that each one of these cultural domains is only possible because there are certain transcendental conditions, certain transcendental principles and transcendental notions that are grounded in the human subject, in human subjectivity, that allow us to construct these realms of cultural meaning. And within these realms of cultural meaning, there are formative symbols, in the same way that for Kant, within our understanding of the natural world, there are the categories of the understanding that are formative. For Cassirer, these are symbols, and he lists time, space, causality, self, and so on. And the point that, or one of the founding points of Cassirer's philosophy of symbolic forms, which is a philosophy of culture, is that in each symbolic form, so in each cultural domain, there is a notion of causality that plays a role. There is a notion of time that plays a role. There is a notion of space that plays a constitutive role. So there is such a thing as religious space. A church is a religiously defined location or space. There is such a thing as political space. Could be a nation, could be a parliament that is a space that has a particular political symbolic meaning. There is a notion of scientific space, of course, which could be that of the universe, or could be that of the space that is occupied by a certain atom. So in each of these cultural domains, we rely on certain symbols, space, but they take on a different meaning in each domain. And Cassirer explains this by saying that the way that we perceive and understand the world is through symbolic imagination. So the very moment that we see something, we already symbolically interpret it. We don't first see a certain space and then next reflect on it and then intelligibly understand it as either a political space or a religious space or or a scientific space. Maybe a simpler example is if you see two lines that intersect, we immediately either interpret it as a plus sign when we are thinking scientifically, or we interpret it and understand it as a crucifix when we are thinking in a religious manner. And so we do this right away. We don't first see or perceive two intersecting lines and then reflect on the meaning that we want to ascribe to it. No, from the very first moment, our sensible intuitions are, as Cassirer calls it, pregnant with symbolic, intelligible meaning. Heidegger has described in a very different manner, has the same basic point in Being and Time in his existential analytic of Dasein, in which he explains that we, as Dasein, are always there in the world, and that means that we always already have an intelligible understanding of our surroundings. We don't first see a material object, but we immediately understand it as something that is useful for us. For example, as a hammer. And when we understand it as a hammer, we immediately also understand it as referring to the nails that we also have, or to the table that needs to be fixed. And that table, in turn, we immediately understand as the table that we use to hold a dinner party or to sit with our family. And Heidegger's, one of the basic ideas of Heidegger's philosophy as well, is that so we don't first see some object that has nothing to do with us, that is unrelated to us, that doesn't have any meaning in itself. We immediately perceive it as meaningfully referring to other beings, the hammer to the nails to the table and so on, and also immediately referring in a meaningful way to us, namely as someone who wants to assemble a table or who wants to hold a dinner party. So the way in which it is described is very different, but they both have this basic idea that human perception, be it as a symbolic animal, as Cassirer calls it, or as a Dasein, as Heidegger calls it, is in essence, both sensitive and intelligent.
So that gets us to sort of the second theme that you identify, which is the very different ideas that Cassirer and Heidegger have concerning the human condition. So let's talk a little bit about that. What are the points of, again, and your book is so brilliant because it identifies both the points of intersection and the points of divergence between these two. But let's talk a little bit about how Cassirer and Heidegger look at the human condition.
Yeah, thanks. So here we see the first transition point, or the first big transition point in the Davos debate, because despite everything I just said, at one point, Cassirer still wants to emphasize the intelligible nature or the spontaneous character of our symbolic perception, and Heidegger still wants to emphasize the receptive nature of Dasein's interaction and involvement in the world. So despite them first emphasizing that there's no duality at the basis, that there is that these two aspects of receptivity and spontaneity are two sides of the same coin, then yet they want to emphasize either one side. And what I try to show in my book is that that's not really motivated by how they understood Kant, or that's not really motivated by what Kant writes, because you can you I mean, Kant's writings on these matters are very complex, and they start picking the quotes that they really like. What really motivates them is a much larger picture of what the human condition is. And it's that idea of what the human condition is that actually motivates their understanding of Kant. And there you see, well, some of the same things. You see on a much larger, on a larger level, they emphasize that the human condition has an aspect of finitude and then of infinity at the same time. But Cassirer really emphasizes the infinite nature of our symbolic imagination, because what he really is interested in is how we are capable of producing all this cultural meaning. All this cultural meaning, politics, science, religion, mythology, all these things that do not exist in nature, that are brought forth by human subjectivity, and that also, with regard to the individual level, will endure past our own existence. Heidegger, on the other hand, he really emphasizes the finite nature of Dasein. Dasein is fundamentally characterized by temporality. Its being in the world is also fundamentally characterized by being thrown into the world, into a world that already exists in a meaningful way before we arrive, because the way in which we interpret the hammer, in which we interpret dinner parties, in which we interpret ourselves, especially, are all embedded within a world that already pre-exists and in which we are thrown and need to find our place. And so, when it comes to the human condition, again, you can see to a certain extent the same view of a split being, of a dual being, not a dualistic being, but a dual being, but then a different emphasis on what is the most fundamental characteristic of this being. And so for Cassirer, that's our infinity, our capacity to bring something new into this world. And for Heidegger, it's more our being thrown into the world and our limits in projecting something meaningful into this world.
And so I want to stop or pause here and maybe come back a little bit to why that distinction is important here, and sort of the symbolic value of not symbolic value, but the symbolism that sort of sometimes obscures our understanding of the philosophy and instead gets us to read the Davos debate somewhat differently through the symbolism. That is, why are these two figures so important on a symbolic level for people?
Great question. You see in the reception of the Davos debate that they were so from the very beginning. And it's, I think, but you've pointed this out before. It's also what has it's also become a flaw, I think, of the reception of the Davos debate in a lot of the literature, because Cassirer and Heidegger, as you said it well, they have become sort of symbols for much larger philosophical positions, but also societal positions. And if you look at the literature about the Davos debate, then you see that they have become sort of paradigms for a number of ideological clashes that marked the 20th century, maybe also 21st century, philosophically, but also politically and sociologically. So Cassirer was a defender of the Weimar Republic. Heidegger, of course, infamously became a defender of the Third Reich. Heidegger was a Jewish cosmopolitan. Cassirer was a Jewish cosmopolitan, whereas Heidegger was a Catholic and staunch defender of more rural provincialist viewpoints. Cassirer was a pacifist above all, whereas for Heidegger, his philosophy and probably also his life was about radical thinking and oppositions and fights and struggles. Cassirer is a cultural optimist, whereas Heidegger was a pessimist or a fatalist, as Cassirer would say. Cassirer embodies a lot of the thoughts, modernity, Enlightenment thoughts, whereas Heidegger has definitely been a big influence on postmodern thinking. And at the time of the Davos debate, in almost all of these aspects, well, let's not mention the Third Reich or Nazism here, let's not include that. But with regard to all of the other oppositions that I mentioned here, Heidegger was much more in tune with the zeitgeist. And so he was much more appealing. His thoughts were much more appealing to the younger crowd that was present at Davos. And they unanimously considered him the winner of the debate. And given that these are figures that then themselves would become important philosophers, that has had a big and also a lasting impact on how the Davos debate has been understood, but also how Cassirer has been, I would say, remembered, but actually I should say forgotten. This Enlightenment optimism, belief in rationality, belief in progress, that was all not very popular in the interbellum, and has not stood the time, at least for a while, over against the more existentialist viewpoints of Heidegger. That also makes revisiting this debate, I think, very interesting in current times, because, of course, the debates about the status of rationality, belief in progress, are still, or once again, very much alive. And it seems that there's also some dissatisfaction with the Heideggerian line of thinking on this. So for that reason, I think it's very, very worthwhile to revisit Cassirer, because he's not at all a one-dimensional or simple defender of these ideas. He has a very interesting notion of rationality. It's not a term that he uses a lot. He will talk about symbolic meaning, but if we want to call it the notion of rationality, then it's one that's very broad, because it's not just about scientific rationality. Politics also is based on a form of rationality. Religion is based on a form of rationality. Language is, mythology is. And so also today it might be more than ever since Cassirer is dead, very interesting to reconsider that. But you're absolutely right in the sense that they have become sort of symbols or paradigms of societal and philosophical viewpoints. And in both cases, I think there's a lot of interesting nuances that can be made there.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot of interesting nuances. Excuse me. It's interesting. I just stumbled across an article, and I'm going to apologize in advance to the author, who identifies going through Cassirer's papers, which are now becoming published and available, a misreading of his final posthumous work, The Myth of the State, which has a really for Cassirer scholars, it's The Myth of the State is always this kind of odd piece, and this rereading based on some of his original notes, I think, really complicates our understanding of that work. I guess we should move on to the final piece, having to do with your arguments regarding their, again, similar but opposing conceptions of the task of philosophy.
Yeah. So if I may, first very clearly emphasize, the thesis of my book is that yes, there was a philosophically rich profound, true dialogue between these two thinkers. There are a number of moments when they do talk past each other, when they didn't exactly maybe understood the other or wanted to make up another point instead. This is by no means something that is only typical for this debate. This, of course, happens in a lot of debates. But I think there's a very clear philosophical thread in the debate, and that's a thread that moves from the topic of Kant's philosophy and the lasting relevance of Kant's philosophy, then to the human condition, and then now to the third topic of the task of philosophy. And so my claim is, more specifically, that that the Davos debate is ultimately a debate about the task of philosophy, and Cassirer and Heidegger's diverging viewpoints on that task is what motivates their different conceptions of the human condition. And it's those different conceptions of the human condition that in turn motivate their diverging readings of Kant's philosophy. But this is the real topic, I think. This is really where they stop seeing eye to eye. When the first topic on Kant, they actually still agreed for the most part, but then started to diverge. Here, this is where they really clash. And that is not to say that they are just two, that they are two emblems of two different paradigms, but they do have very different takes on what that is. And those takes are, as I indicated, they are tied up with their views of the human condition. So if the human condition is such that what really makes us human, what really makes humanity develop, is the fact that we are capable of transcending our natural side, and we have this symbolic side through which we create cultural meaning, then the task of philosophy is to understand this and encourage this. Which means, in other words, that the task of philosophy is to achieve self-understanding of the human being, and then also to aid the self-realization of the human being and of humanity. And the philosophy of symbolic forms tries to do this by showing this diversity of cultural domains. So shows that it's not just science that makes us above other animals, but it's it's both science and language and art. I've been failing to mention that symbolic form, and politics and even mythology. And the key is to not see a very strong hierarchy between these different cultural domains, but to accept the plurality. And if we accept the plurality of different symbolic forms, which all create their own symbolic world or universe and are not just translatable to each other, then that's how we will have the richest cultural life, and how we how we self-realize ourselves the most. So this is the optimistic, cultural optimistic view of the human nature and of human culture that Cassirer defends. Heidegger, with his emphasis on the finite nature and the limited nature and the temporal nature of Dasein, could not possibly defend such a view. So his philosophy, his early philosophy, I should say, as long as he talks about Dasein, is not so much, it's not at all about trying to push us further into a cultural domain, but it's about making us understand our own limitations. So it's not about progress and self-realization, but it's about coming to terms with the shortcomings of our human condition. And whereas I call, in line with Cassirer himself, Cassirer's view on the task of philosophy as a form of enlightenment, I call Heidegger's conception of philosophy a therapeutic conception of philosophy, in the sense that therapy is not supposed to make us get rid of our shortcomings or get rid of our finitude, but helps us learn to live with that. And then you can see how these different views of the task of philosophy are tied up with different views of society, are tied up with different notions and regimes of politics. They don't, need to be tied with very particular political regimes, of course. At least I hope so. But they are fundamentally different views on what philosophy should do, and they are tied with these different notions of the human condition.
Yeah, and again, I think that I especially appreciated your idea of labeling Heidegger's philosophy therapeutic. I thought that was that's just a brilliant framing. Can I ask how you came to it?
So I studied in Leuven at KU Leuven, and although I never really got into that, we had when I was a student, we had a very strong tradition in professors who were also analysts in the psychoanalytic tradition.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so Lacan has visited and spoken at the Institute of Philosophy at Leuven, and there were a number of professors for a long time there who were practicing even analysts, or at least were teaching a lot of Lacan. And as far as I understand it, this is the Lacanian understanding of what therapy means. So the more popular understanding in philosophy of therapy is the Wittgensteinian. That's not the one I mean. I mean the Lacanian, in which therapy is about trying to make amends with your own shortcomings, trying to live with them. So I borrowed it from there. I think it applies to Heidegger in this sense as well.
Yeah, and just another interesting aside. There's in my own field of communication, I think it's Michael Hyde writes about and uses Heidegger to talk about what he labels rhetorical physicianship, and so I think there's some interesting parallels going on there.
Okay, so what does it mean, rhetorical physicianship?
The idea that that rhetoric, and again, my field is rhetorical studies, has the responsibility to minister to or to heal the world, as opposed. This is a very broad brushstroke, so, but essentially to attend to, minister, or help to heal wounds, as opposed to the more conflictual ideas that often get circulated around rhetorical studies.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, and just as an aside, it's the piece that I was mentioning before is Chiara. I'm going to butcher this last name, I'm sure. Bottici, yes. Who is Afraid of the Myth of the State? Really terrific piece. So, as we come to the conclusion, is there any last few words you'd like to say about the Davos debate?
Yes, absolutely. Maybe, yeah. So last words for here. In the end, once I got through these three topics, let me say two things. So first, this is the philosophical structure that I saw in the debate, and that, on my view, renders it a true philosophical dialogue. But in order to really see that, you have to weed through other passages in the debate that seem tangential, or that maybe are not clearly connected. In order to see that, it helps to look at two other things, and the first one is the much longer Cassirer-Heidegger dispute, as I call it, which is the collection of all the instances in which Cassirer and Heidegger engaged with each other. through book reviews, through comments and footnotes on the other's works. And that is a conversation that started in 1923 already, and that would last because not because Heidegger cared anymore, but because Cassirer became increasingly worried. That lasted until 1946. So that's The Myth of the State, posthumously published, in which Cassirer, for the last time and most firmly of all instances, really criticizes Heidegger's fatalistic conception of philosophy. So it helps to look at all these other instances in which they engage to see the same structure, to see the same three topics return, and also with the same hierarchical interrelation. But then what really, I think, supports my claim is that if you look at Cassirer's own philosophy and Heidegger's own early philosophy, that you also see that these are three key topics of their thought that are related to each other in that sense. So Cassirer's philosophy, Cassirer's writings engage a lot with Immanuel Kant's thought, and they turn or they develop his critique of reason into a much broader critique of culture. So the whole project of the philosophy of symbolic forms is a continuation of Kant's transcendental and critical philosophy. In doing so, in order to back up this philosophy of culture, he needs to develop a new notion of human subjectivity, which leads to his very rarely addressed but very important conception of the human being as an animal symbolicum, a symbolic animal. And all of this is, of course, within his philosophy of culture, which, as he grows older, becomes more and more a philosophy that has a clear task of liberating human beings. On the other hand, in Cassirer's own early philosophy, there's also multiple books that are that engage with Kant's philosophy. They do it at great detail, and this engagement with Kant is, as Being in Time clarifies, a crucial element of his philosophy, because it is a part of his destruction of the history of philosophy, which is necessary because, as Being in Time opens, we have forgotten being, and we have even forgotten the question about being. And so we need to destruct or deconstruct the history of philosophy, specifically Kant's philosophy, in order to regain a sense of what being is. The other pillar of that attempt to regain a sensibility of being is, of course, his analytic of Dasein. That's what Being in Time is mostly about. So there's also this conception of Dasein that goes hand in hand with his, and that runs parallel actually with his interpretation of Kant. And these two lines of thinking, as I said, are part of a broader idea of what the task of philosophy is, and it is to revive ontology. And in order to that, he has to build up a theory of Dasein as temporal, as a being that is able to own itself. So that's one thing that I wanted to add. So these are the sources, I think, that back it up. If you read the transcript of the Davos debate in itself, then then I can understand that you don't see a coherent philosophical engagement. But if you look at all these other sources, and if you look at the importance of these topics discussed in Davos for their own thought, then you cannot but see that they are, with all the flaws that are there, they are debating truly philosophical topics that are very dear to them, on which they have a number of touching points, but then also on which they need to clearly separate themselves. So that's the one thing I wanted to add. And then the second thing is that if you look at then the coherence of these three topics, then my final thesis is that they are all connected through a shared interest a shared interest between Cassirer and Heidegger, in the human capacity to orient ourselves in the world and towards the world. And that's what the human condition is like for both thinkers, that we as human beings, as symbolic animals or as Dasein, are in our very essence all the time concerned and engaged with orienting ourselves. That's what symbolic imagination does. That's what being in the world also means. But we are also, every now and then, and this is what philosophy especially does, we are also interested and engaged with orienting ourselves towards the world. So we also want to understand how this orientation within the world, our orientation within science, within politics, within religion, within art, how these different orientations can go together. And that's what the philosophy of culture of Cassirer wants to understand, how we can have these different cultural domains that have nothing to do with each other. We can jump from one to the other, and they do together make our world. So how do we orient ourselves towards the world? And that's where Cassirer's pluralism comes in. And we need to be cultural pluralists. Heidegger is also very much interested in how we orient ourselves towards the world. After describing how we are beings in the world who always already understand the beings, the tools, the other human beings around us, he then is interested in how we orient ourselves towards the world. And like, how do we do this orientation? Do we do it by just following the day? Do we do it by following just public opinion about what public opinion says that a dinner party should be? What public opinion prescribes that the kind of human being we should be? Or do we do it in our own or authentic way? Do we do it based on our own potentiality as a Dasein? And it's this tension between orientation within the world and orientation towards the world that I think is the crucial topic in order to understand the motivation behind Cassirer's entire philosophy of culture, and then also Heidegger's early philosophy. And so, even overarching these three topics, the meaning of Kant's thought, the human condition, and the task of philosophy, there is, I think, this motivation to understand how we orient ourselves in the world.
Well, I'm glad I asked that question because, again, I think it's. I think what you said is absolutely brilliant and so important again for this contemporary moment that we're all living through. So let me finish up and ask Simon Truwant, what's next?
Well, something that follows in a way, but doesn't as closely rely on the history of philosophy. My current research project is on post-truth. So the idea that we no longer live in a world in which the truth matters or in which facts matter, but allegedly only emotions and ideology matters. So this is an idea that it's a term that exists for a longer time, since the 90s, but it's an idea that became very popular after the Brexit and after the election of Donald Trump, both in 2016. And it's, for me, it's an overarching topic in light of many topics that have become very popular, both in the media, but definitely also within academia. The topics of fake news, of disinformation, of populism, of polarization. And what I want to do is look at the different notions of truth that still play a role in our public debates. So I agree that we no longer seem to have a very clear understanding of what truth is, or at least we no longer seem to have a clear shared understanding of what truth is. There are, and I want to try to solve that is really too ambitious, but I want to try to bring some clarity into that by arguing that we do use in our daily lives, but also in public debates, we actually rely on multiple notions of truth. And we have become confused about what the differences are and when to use which one. Right? So there is factual truth, there is ideological truth, there is lived truth, there's pragmatic truth. These are four notions of truth that are grounded in philosophical theories, in correspondence theory, in a coherence theory, in pragmatism, in phenomenology. But each time what truth means has different criteria. And so I think philosophy can actually help here by defending a truth pluralism, a plurality of truth conceptions, can maybe help get some clearer understanding of public debates. Because in a public debate about climate change, for example, but also about transgender identities, there are scientific, factual claims that can be made and can be either true or false. There are political, ideological claims that can be made and that are truthful or untruthful. There are lived experiences that can be expressed and that can also be truthful or untruthful. And it's only by properly distinguishing these ideas of these notions of truth that we'll be able to get somewhere. Because if you look at public debates on social media, one person makes a scientific claim, the next person answers by making a political statement, and the third person responds by sharing a lived experience, and the debate doesn't go anywhere, or the debate goes into circles. I think we can only have some productive and also respectful public debates if we distinguish these different notions of truth. And I don't know if it's clear, but this is inspired by Cassirer's pluralism, of course. That for Cassirer, you could say there is artistic object. He says that there's artistic objectivity, there's scientific objectivity, there's political objectivity, there's religious objectivity. If you translate it to the notion of truth, then you can try to come up in a Cassirerian fashion, maybe with a form of truth pluralism that respects the identity and the criteria of these different kinds of truths, but that tries to somehow bring some harmony in between them, and instead of have them fight with each other, try them to be co-constructive.
Well, we'll look forward to getting that as soon as it comes out. And hopefully we'll have you back and have another conversation.
Well, it definitely also involves a lot of rhetoric, so I'm sure you could also teach me a lot about that from the communication and the rhetorics aspect. Yeah.
Sure. Again, excuse me. My guest today has been Simon Truwant. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. Again, it's a terrific book. Congratulations on its publication. And again, we'll look forward to that next project when it comes out.
Thank you. Me too.
Once again, my guest today has been Simon Truwant, the author of Cassirer and Heidegger in Davos, The Philosophical Argument, new from Cambridge University Press. My name is Tom Discenna, and you are listening to the New Books Network.